How would you interact with somebody who denies the imputation of Christ's righteousness?
Well, it would depend on what the occasion is, what the circumstance is. So, for example, if it's a presbytery exam, should we ordain this fellow, or should we recommend that he be ordained or installed as a pastor of this church? Then the way I'd handle it is if he denied the imputation of Christ flat out, if he understood the doctrine, stated the doctrine, and then denied it, I would vote against him being ordained. I don't think a pastor has the luxury of being wrong on that. If he was muddy on it, just muddled on what it was, and he denied it but what he was denying was not the doctrine,
Sure.
right? Which is what N.T. Wright does in what St. Paul really said, or what St. Paul really taught. N.T. Wright talks about imputation rays sort of float wafting across the courtroom.
Oh, right. Okay.
Right, but that's not what imputation is. So he's denying something that. So if I'd want to know if someone stated the doctrine accurately and winsomely, accurately, biblically, if the person would still deny it, then I would say that's problematic for ministry.
Could you, just as we go forward, could you summarize what you would want to hear to say, yeah, that's an accurate statement of the doctrine?
Yeah, imputation is a legal and forensic declaration that establishes a new legal status for the person about whom it's spoken. Okay. So imputation would be when a jury says we find the defendant not guilty, or we find the defendant guilty. Now, let's say the defendant had committed a murder. He was personally, morally guilty, but he's not legally guilty. That legal declaration establishes a new legal category, and that's imputation. Or when I announce that a man and his fiance are husband and wife. You may kiss the bride. That's imputation. That's a legal forensic declaration that accomplishes, that brings about a new legal status. That's imputation. If you say, when I announce that a husband and wife are husband and wife, I'm not pouring husband juices into him. Right. I'm not pouring wifely juices into her. It's not infusion. I'm not altering their character. I'm not doing anything inside them. It's declaratory. So that's what imputation is. And God's declaration of no condemnation over us is a legal forensic declaration. And I believe that everyone who's responsible for preaching the word needs to have that right, needs to have that down. If, however, you went to 100 sound evangelical churches whose elders and pastor could all wonderfully explain this to you, but you stopped congregants at the door after an average church service and asked them to take a brief quiz on justification, sanctification, legal imputation, most wouldn't do that well.
Right.
And the fact that they don't do that well simply means to me that these congregations need to be more ably taught, or we need teaching on this, we need declaration, we need to bring these people up to speed. So it's not a matter of chastisement or discipline, it's a matter of disciplining the preacher to preach the gospel more faithfully, more forcefully.
Okay. What are some of the ways that if somebody is not just the congregant who was a little bit muddled on it, but if a theologian is trying to skirt the issue, what are the ways that what are the kinds of arguments they would put up against imputation that would be an alarm for you?
Oh, one of the standard arguments is that imputation is a legal fiction, right? Well, it's not a legal fiction to say that that you're now husband and wife. That's not a legal fiction. That's a legal statement. So 1 minute they're not married, the next minute they are. What is it that does that? Well, it's a declaration. 1 minute the defendant is not free to walk out of the courtroom. The next minute he is free to walk out of the courtroom. What is it that makes it? if I pronounce not guilty, if I'm the foreman of the jury and I say we the jury find the defendant not guilty, why don't people stop us and say that's just a legal fiction? It's not a legal fiction. He's free to go.
Right.
Now, one part of the thing that confuses this is people then say, well, how if we are guilty and justification is God's declaration over us that we are not guilty, how can God make that declaration without himself becoming guilty when we're guilty? Well, that's the whole problem that Romans is addressing. God wanted to be just and the one who justifies. In order to be just, he had to condemn us. In order to be the one who justifies, he had to say not guilty. And God wanted to condemn and not condemn at the same time. And the way he found the deep mystery that he unveiled in how to do this was to establish a new head of the human race who took all the sins of all his people onto himself, and God pronounced him guilty. So in 2 Corinthians 5, God made him who knew no sin to be sin for us. And that was an imputation. God made him to be sin for us so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. So when it comes to salvation, there's a triple imputation. There's the imputation of Adam's sin to us. There's the imputation of our sin to Christ, and the imputation of Christ's righteousness to us. Now, because of that, because Christ's righteousness is imputed to us, because our sin is imputed to him, God can impute Christ's righteousness to us without incurring guilt, because satisfaction for the sin punishment for the sin has been meted out.
Okay. And to what extent does union with Christ, when we talk about being in Christ,
Right.
To what extent, if somebody describes this satisfaction all in terms of union with Christ and maybe doesn't bring up imputation, is that the sort of thing that you would say, yeah, you can use union with Christ to explain the exact same thing, or do you think that you need that extra language
No,
also?
I think you need that extra language also, because union, when you say union with Christ, what do you mean? Well, there is actual union with Christ. So going back to the distinction between imputation and infusion, the Protestants believe that God's righteousness is infused into us. We believe there's an actual change of heart. We're regenerated. We're changed.
Right.
We're being changed from one degree of glory to another. So there is something going on in us.
Right.
We're simply saying that that's not the basis for our legal declaration before God, the legal declaration of not guilty. Because even on my good days, if I'm being declared righteous based on my sanctification, then I'm sunk.
Right.
I'm lost, because my sanctification is always imperfect. I must be put right with God or not based on a perfect declaration. So that's justification. So if you just say union with Christ, and you have this idea of Jesus and his people sort of in a mashup, they're all together. You've got union with Christ. I want to know still further, union in what sense, right? I think we still need a legal forensic declaration of union, and we also need actual union of fellowship, union. Right? So before the married couple can have union, they have to have a forensic union. Right. So an engaged couple, 3 days to the wedding, there's certain things they can't touch. Stay away. No, not yours, not yours, not yours. When a legal and forensic declaration of union is made, then that opens the door to one flesh. Right? And I think both are necessary. So I'm not disputing actual union with God through Christ. I'm simply saying it has to begin with a forensic declaration of union.
Okay.